I've heard a lot of discourse surrounding the International Monetary Fund, mostly from the socialist left and sometimes the populist right. The socialist left's argument about the IMF is often that the IMF is an example of capitalism killing labor reform and socialist movements, and that this is part of the reason why we don't see a lot of examples of stable and sustainable socialist governments. The populist right will also talk about how the IMF promotes neoliberal policies, but the populist right often talks about this in the frame of defending isolationist and protectionist policies. These criticisms made me want to look into the IMF, its practices, and its outcomes. Today, I want to answer three main questions. 1. What does the IMF do? 2. Where does the IMF get its money? And 3. Does the IMF predatorily lend to developing nations to stymie socialist policies and movements with conditional loan arrangements? To begin, the IMF was created as part of a conference between government representatives across the world who determined it necessary to start an international organization to encourage international trade in response to the protectionist policies across the world post-World War II. The IMF began lending in 1947, and today nearly every country is a member of the IMF. The only nations who are not formal members of the IMF today are, from smallest to largest, Vatican City, Liechtenstein, I assume I'm pronouncing that wrong, Monaco, East Timor, Cuba, Taiwan, and North Korea. The IMF's primary mission, according to its website, is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, the system of exchange rates and international payments that enables countries and their citizens to transact with each other. This takes the form of the IMF essentially extending credit or loans to countries given certain lending conditions. Conditions meaning that the borrower has some demonstrable need for credit and that the credit given is for a specific purpose or reason, sometimes with specific obligations of the borrower. Now that we have a basic overview of the IMF, where does the IMF get its money, and is the IMF simply a global north and/or capitalist shill organization that kills labor reform and good socialist governance abroad? To begin, the IMF doesn't necessarily deal in US dollars, or any dollars for that matter. The main medium of exchange the IMF deals in is called SDRs, or special drawing rights. SDRs are an asset created by the IMF, which is essentially a collection of global currencies standardized into single units. Currently, according to the IMF bylaws, 100 SDRs is made up of around 58.25 US dollars, 38.67 euros, 101.74 Chinese renminbi, 1190 Japanese yen, and 8.59 British pounds. This means that 100 SDRs would be worth around 142 USD as of March 2021. In terms of the actual funding, the IMF gets its funding from three primary sources. 1. Quotas paid by member countries. 2. New arrangements to borrow, or NABs, rhymes with dabs, where countries essentially agree to lend to the IMF if the IMF needs to distribute additional credit. And 3. Bilateral borrowing agreements, or BBAs, made between the IMF and its member countries. As of March 2021, the IMF controls about 975 billion SDRs, which are worth about 1.4 trillion USD between quotas, NABs, and BBAs. The breakdown of these funds is about 49% quotas from member countries, 37% NABs, and 14% BBAs. The top 15 IMF member countries provide over 73% of total contributions to the IMF. They are, in order of largest to smallest percentage of total IMF contributions, the United States, Japan, China, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Saudi Arabia, India, Russia, the Netherlands, Brazil, Canada, Spain, and Switzerland. One of the leading socialist narratives regarding the IMF is that it is controlled by the United States, the global north, Western countries, and/or capitalist shill countries overall. It's important to note that although the top 15 countries contribute 73% of IMF resources, they only control about 62% of the vote share regarding IMF decision-making. This is because IMF voting control is based only on the quotas countries pay and not the total contributions to the IMF, which would include NABs and BBAs. It's also worth noting that voting power disproportionately favors smaller countries even when only looking at quota contributions. The top 15 countries in terms of total resource contribution contribute about 65% of the quota to the IMF and receive only 62% of the IMF vote. But Econoboy, what about the global north and south? Surely the IMF is just a shill for the global north. Well, not really, comrade. The global north contributes about 67% of IMF quota and gets only 65% of the vote. However, the global north contributes 74% of all resources available to the IMF, but again remains at only 65% of the total vote. But Econoboy, the global north and larger countries still control a large majority of the IMF, surely this still means that the IMF is just a shill for the global north or larger nations. Well, it arguably depends on what the IMF is voting on and how you view the dynamics of the IMF. According to the Articles of Agreement from the IMF, it requires 70% or 85% of the total IMF vote in order to make any changes to its rules or structure and in order to enact essentially any IMF agreement. This is a list of the things the IMF needs 70% agreement on, and this is a list of things the IMF needs 85% agreement on. But you see, Econo Boy, the global north and larger countries will simply bully the global south or smaller countries to vote how they would like. Well, there are voting blocs and alliances as there are with essentially any democratic structure that is international or broad in nature. But keep in mind there are also a lot of global interests at play, mostly built on strategic alliances, and given the thresholds of 70 and 85%, any formal action taken by the IMF has to be very broadly agreed on in nature, with many national security, economic, and personal dynamics at play. Essentially, I'm not sure it's provable that the IMF is simply a shill for any one country, one voting bloc, or one ideology, since the world's governances and ideologies are not so homogeneous as to lead to a minority viewpoint being unrepresented. 70% and 85% as thresholds means that there must necessarily be some ideological diversity in the final decisions of the IMF. And this makes some intuitive sense. A country, whether more capitalist like Canada or more communist like Vietnam, will possibly need credit at points in time based on the global dynamics at play, their individual economy, and the surrounding specific geopolitical context. The IMF engages in several types of lending, but more or less the main source of controversy from the IMF has to do with what the IMF calls concessional financing. This is the credit or loans they extend to countries which are experiencing financial difficulties, and these loans are predicated on some assortment of policy concessions on the part of the borrowing nation. It's these fiscal concessions the socialist left will use as examples of the IMF's economic and capitalist imperialism. This is because often these concessions include the borrowing nation balancing its fiscal state to a certain extent, either through cutting spending, raising taxes, or both. Critics of this practice will point to examples of IMF member countries being strapped with seemingly unsustainable debt that partially traps the selected country in a cycle of toxic dependence. A decent example of this would be after 2008 and 2009, when the Greek government ended up in a fiscal crisis and could not come to an agreement with the IMF and international creditors. By the end, Greece was essentially forced to implement austerity measures, which led to a lackluster recovery from the 2008 and 2009 crisis, which precipitated all the way until 2019, where Greece was finally able to begin issuing bonds again, right in time for the 2020 coronavirus recession. But that's a story for another time. This example illuminates the most fundamental criticisms of the IMF as a capitalist institution. They come in, implement austerity, make governments cut social welfare spending, and the people of these governments suffer because of it. This is true and it does happen, but it's not really because of capitalist organization. The IMF does believe in free and liberal markets, but the centerpiece of its credit packages is the country's ability to sustainably finance itself, so as to avoid future need for emergency IMF credit agreements. A liberal criticism of organizations like the IMF is that the existence of an international credit bank that will swoop in at the point that a government is experiencing a fiscal crisis is that this creates a clear potential for moral hazard. Moral hazard in economics is the idea that an actor in an economy is guarded or insulated somehow from the risks associated with its actions. If this is the case, for example, a country could essentially blow out its fiscal state, run massive and unsustainable deficits, and they wouldn't necessarily need to care because the IMF could just come in, offer favorable loan terms in order to refinance its debt, and greatly extend its debt maturities. This is why the IMF negotiates for concessions in its credit agreements. If a country finds itself in a fiscal state such that it requires an international bailout, the organization giving the bailout needs to be sure the country requiring the bailout implements structures to make a future bailout less likely, because without these conditions, a moral hazard exists in the market, and there's not necessarily a negative disincentive for a government improperly managing its finances. This isn't the IMF trying to screw over developing or socialist economies, it's the IMF trying to ensure future sustainable fiscal states for the countries it's lending to. Don't get me wrong, there are legitimate reasons to criticize the IMF. A great analysis I found from economist Axel Dreyer found that the IMF's loans don't appear to have clear and/or positive effects on economic growth, and the technocratic nature of the IMF can certainly leave a bad taste in the mouths of the citizens from countries where they are forced to tighten their welfare programs. Dreyer also points out a salient criticism of the IMF, that the IMF does not distinguish truly between the countries it works with. This might sound like a good thing, and it is somewhat, but it does lead the IMF to work with oppressive regimes like China or Saudi Arabia. Austerity is bad economics, certainly, but if a crisis in a nation arises out of an exorbitant public expenditure that's built on the back of deficit spending that is not productive, the only logical alternative for that country is to somewhat tighten its spending or raise taxes to an amount that it would be able to sustainably finance its fiscal state. To end, there are great debates on the structures of the IMF's necessity on an international level, and its ability to successfully implement sound economic policy across nations. But the criticism that the IMF works to destroy or dismantle labor reforms and socialist movements more generally is wrong and unproductive, because this criticism tends to misunderstand the motivations of the IMF and prevents a well-rounded and contextual analysis of the IMF's actions abroad. The best and most holistic way to criticize an institution is to get in the weeds of the institution, go line by line, policy by policy, event by event, action by action, and try to take away the most specific need for reform, and in this case, that approach wouldn't reasonably lead a person to conclude that the IMF is some cabal of capitalists influencing and killing off socialist reform, but rather an institution tasked with providing international credit to unsustainably indebted countries in lackluster economic states, socialist or otherwise.